Daniel Lowell had always believed in quiet strength, in solving problems with reason, maintaining order, and, above all, trusting systems designed to protect people. He wasn't naive, just methodical. His wife, Ellison, was even more so. A crisis management consultant specializing in physical security and tactical protocol design, Ellison had spent the last 15 years helping private communities across the country write safety regulations and firearms use procedures for their contracted security forces. She had been brought into dozens of high-tension environments, places where panic had led to lawsuits or where too much authority in the wrong hands had ended in tragedy. And each time, her reputation for firm, scalable guidelines had made her indispensable. She didn't just know how these systems worked, she built them. 6 months ago, they moved into a meticulously planned residential community in the northern part of the state, tucked behind soft hills and dense lines of cedar trees. The streets were clean, lighting was low and warm, landscaping was uniform but not oppressive. Every driveway curved just enough to suggest distinction, even when the houses themselves were variants of the same 3 architectural styles. Daniel had spent most of his career working in agro-tech development, a quietly intense job that combined satellite irrigation control with soil bioanalysis. The quietness of their new home was more than a lifestyle change. It was a reward. After years of travel, consulting, and always being on call, this was supposed to be their place of rest. Not permanent retirement, but a phase where they'd invest more in home life than anything else. On a cool Sunday in early spring, Daniel woke to the smell of coffee and the distant, muffled bark of their shepherd mix, Juno. Ellison had gone on one of her morning runs, a habit she maintained even through winter. She liked early mornings, empty streets, and the predictable rhythm of her breath over asphalt. Daniel expected her back within minutes. She always made it a loop. Never more than 45 minutes, but the knock at the front door wasn't her. When Daniel opened it, Juno stood alone on the front step, leash dragging behind her. Her paw was smeared with dirt and what looked like dried blood. The sight alone was enough to start a ringing in his ears. The dog never got out of Ellison's grip, especially not on runs. And Ellison never let her wander out of sight. Ever. Juno pushed past him and curled up on the rug, panting heavily. Daniel closed the door slowly and grabbed his phone. He called once. No answer. Called again. Voicemail. Then he pulled up the shared GPS tracker they used when hiking, a leftover habit from their earlier field work. Her last location pinged a half-mile north, along the utility trail that skirted the perimeter of the community, the part that backed into the drainage corridor and then curved back toward the southern walking path. A dead zone for both visibility and reception. It had been flagged once during her original security walkthrough when she reviewed the property's risk points. She had marked it as low risk with poor visibility at night. He was already halfway down the back steps before the phone buzzed in his pocket. Ellison had returned. He turned to see her at the gate. She was standing upright but clearly off balance, her ponytail messy, clothing smeared with dirt, and her cheek was red with a shallow scrape that looked like it had already scabbed. Her eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp, wide and focused in a way that made Daniel instantly slow his approach. "I'm fine," she said quickly, even before he reached her. "Nothing happened. I'm fine." "What do you mean, nothing happened? Where's your phone?" "Lost it. Somewhere along the trail. It slipped when I was... Look, it doesn't matter. I just want a shower." He didn't push immediately, but the moment the door closed behind them and she saw Juno's paw, Ellison exhaled and sat down hard on the bottom step of the stairs. She looked at Daniel, and he saw that her fingers were trembling slightly. "He pointed it at me," she said softly. "Full extension, both hands, right at my chest, not a bluff. Daniel stared at her, the words crashing through the surface of his calm. Who? One of their security contractors. New face, no badge number visible. Said I wasn't registered for movement after 9. I identified myself. I used the ID phrase I wrote. I even used the escalation code, the one we agreed on. He kept the weapon on me. 4 minutes, maybe 5, until I backed away and he let me go. She rubbed the side of her neck, breathing slower now. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. He just wanted me scared. Daniel's instincts went into overdrive. In his field, when data contradicted established protocol, you didn't wait. You isolated the failure point. You got clarity before systems spiraled. They filed a formal incident report the next morning, but the reply came 12 hours later. A brief, polished email that thanked them for their concern and confirmed that no inappropriate conduct had been observed. According to Security's internal system, Ellison had engaged verbally with a licensed officer who acted within policy standards during a compliance interaction. No further action would be taken. A footnote indicated that recorded footage was not available due to hardware update in that quadrant. Ellison's expression when she read that note was cold, like a locked room. Daniel watched her pull up her archived protocols, scanning line by line through the weapons discharge flow chart, the high-risk interaction clause, the visual ID procedures. And then, after a long pause, she froze. There was a sentence she hadn't written. In the section titled, Unauthorized Presence During Restricted Hours, someone had added language that permitted a contractor to brandish a weapon if the subject fails to comply within 30 seconds of first warning, regardless of ID status, low visibility conditions. It was phrased exactly in her tone. Clean, passive, legally durable. That's not mine, she said. That wasn't in the signed version. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. It's got your edit signature. Metadata shows your terminal. She didn't respond for a few seconds. Then, someone mirrored my login. Someone who wanted this to look like standard escalation, Daniel added quietly. Oh. It had taken one evening for them to realize the system Ellison helped design had been re-engineered behind her back. That the weapon pointed at her wasn't a mistake. It was a demonstration. And more than that, it was legally covered. By her own name. And so began the unraveling of everything they thought they'd secured. A clean community, vetted staff, transparent policy. What should have been an isolated breach of procedure revealed itself as something else entirely. A shift in the operational ethics of the private security structure, one that no longer required approval from its own architects to implement dangerous or new rules. In the coming days, Ellison would discover more language in the revised documents. Paragraphs she hadn't written, approvals she hadn't signed, deployment permissions she'd never drafted. And each of them traced back to a version of her account, perfectly masked, authenticated through the network she had helped build and trusted for years. But none of that would matter if the foundation of accountability had already been removed. And it had. Because this wasn't about a rogue guard or a glitch or one bad policy. This was about control. And Ellison Lowell had written the blueprint. Someone else had just changed the locks. The next 72 hours were defined by a quiet unease that Daniel couldn't shake, even as he tried to maintain their routine. The email from the community office sat unanswered in their inbox, the finality of its phrasing almost daring them to contest it. Ellison was outwardly calm but visibly affected, moving through the house with the precision of someone rationing energy. She spent long stretches in her office, headphones on, reviewing backups of her old documents. On the third evening, she called in a favor from a contact she'd worked with during a major security overhaul for a financial tech campus in Phoenix. someone with access to a software validation lab that could run version comparisons against archived source code and metadata. She sent them 3 versions of her security doctrine, including the one currently in place in the community system. The request was simple. Trace the timestamp origins, verify authentication paths, and look for mismatches. While she waited, Daniel decided to approach the matter from a different angle. Rather than rehash the complaint with the community board, which had already shown its loyalty to official narratives, he focused on identifying the security contractor who had pointed the weapon. They had no name, no badge number, and no footage, which was suspicious enough. But Daniel remembered something else. The night of the incident, Juno had come home with a bloodied paw. They hadn't found a source. So he retraced Ellison's route, walking the utility path at the same time of day she had, mapping each corner, blind turn, and lighting fixture. The path was quiet. No one followed. At the far edge, where the trail curved behind the retention wall, he found what he hadn't expected, a set of scuffed footprints in the mulch, as if someone had stood off path for a long time. Embedded near one edge was a shattered fragment of what looked like a rubber muzzle tip. Not standard issue, but consistent with crowd control gear, the kind used in riot zones. Not what you expected from a suburban security patrol. When he showed Ellison, she didn't flinch. "That's not even legal here," she said. "No licensed company in this district uses military model restraints, not unless they're on a federal contract, and not without disclosure." Later that night, the report from her contact came back. The results were chilling. The digital signature on the modified protocol wasn't spoofed. It had been replicated. Whoever did it didn't just forge her credentials. They cloned the encryption key associated with her account, meaning they had access at the system's level. That required more than a break-in. It required a handoff. Someone with admin-level privileges on the document management platform had deliberately enabled remote credential injection. Worse, the revision history had been scrubbed. Normally, the platform logged every edit, even reverted ones. But in this case, a forensic trace revealed a wipe event. 2 weeks prior to the incident, someone ran a targeted purge on her access logs, then re-uploaded the official version of her protocol with the new language embedded. "Oh, I didn't just lose control of my authorship," she said grimly. "I lost control of my name." Daniel didn't respond. He was still processing the implications. But the fallout arrived quicker than either of them anticipated. The following morning, a letter was hand-delivered to their home by a uniformed courier from the community board, not the postal service. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a formal notice. A resident had filed a misconduct complaint against Ellison for interfering with site operations and attempting unauthorized access to classified protocols. No specifics were given. The final paragraph read, "Pending review, your access to administrative panels and policy development boards has been suspended. Please do not attempt to engage with any on-duty security personnel without prior written approval." Ellison stood in the doorway, reading the letter silently, then folded it once and placed it on the console. "They're going to paint me as unstable," she said. "First, they simulate a threat. Then, they gaslight the record. Now, they isolate the subject. Classic pressure campaign." Daniel's response was immediate and pragmatic. "We need representation." By noon, they had contacted a legal firm that specialized in liability disputes involving private governance entities. Their assigned attorney, a woman named Fair 11, was sharp, calm, and immediately understood the stakes. "They're consolidating control," she said bluntly during their first call. "Your protocols are valuable intellectual property, and if they're reshaped to justify new, aggressive practices, that has implications. Liability, ethics, and possibly criminal misuse if anyone gets hurt. If your name is still tied to them, they have leverage. Levin instructed them not to respond to any further correspondence without routing it through her. She also recommended they document every interaction, even casual ones, from this point forward. The next step was to begin a formal challenge to the continued use of Ellison's protocols under fraudulent authorship. She drafted a cease and desist, citing the Digital Signature Act and intellectual property protections under state law. The letter demanded an immediate freeze on all deployments of the modified doctrine and a full audit of all revision logs. They served the notice within 24 hours. The response wasn't public, but it was loud. 3 days after Levine submitted the formal challenge, Daniel's access badge to the main gate stopped working. The automated entry system displayed a message: Resident temporarily restricted. Contact admin. When he called the office, they claimed it was a malfunction and advised him to use the side entrance. That entrance was only available during business hours. When he tried to clarify the restriction, the call was placed on hold indefinitely. Meanwhile, the garbage service stopped picking up their bin. Their mailbox received 3 separate notices of delivery failure due to access dispute. And a small sign appeared overnight on their front lawn. Not official, not stamped, but placed with professional precision. Oh, it read simply, "Do not engage without supervision." Ellison ripped it out with one hand and threw it in the garage. But the message was clear. They weren't being ignored. They were being watched, controlled, nudged. That night, a single-page envelope slid under their front door. Inside was a printout. A black-and-white capture of Ellison's credentials, the original version from her first week on the Security Oversight Board. Across it was scrawled in marker, "Just doing your job. Welcome to the other side." Daniel stared at it long and hard. They're not trying to intimidate you. They're letting you know you were always part of the machine. Ellison didn't answer. She stood in silence, gripping the edge of the counter, her eyes unreadable. She had written the system to protect people. Now it was being used to monitor them, using her name, her voice, her work, and the worst part wasn't that they'd turned it against her. It was that they had done it quietly, cleanly, without breaking a single rule, because they had changed the rules first. The breaking point did not arrive with sirens or screaming. It came in the form of a perfectly ordinary morning that Daniel would later remember for how uneventful it seemed. The coffee brewed on schedule. The sky was overcast but dry, and Ellison sat at the kitchen table revising a personal draft of an ethics guideline she'd once started as a side project. Something never submitted to any agency or client. It had nothing to do with the current chaos, and that was the point. They needed the illusion of normalcy, even if it was brittle. By mid-morning, Daniel had gone to the shared garage on the north side of the community where residents kept tools and garden supplies. It was rarely occupied, and he welcomed the silence. But as he reached the coded entry panel, his card was rejected again. Not invalid, just flagged. He stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether to call the admin line when he noticed the man across the lot. Not security, not uniformed, just a tall figure in a dark jacket, watching him from the shade of a sycamore. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Daniel stared back, waiting. When the man finally turned and walked away, Daniel followed at a distance, not in pursuit, but out of the kind of instinct that comes when something doesn't fit. The man cut across the walkway, past a cluster of homes still under construction, and entered the side entrance of the operations building. That building, to Daniel's knowledge, was only accessed by internal staff and licensed contractors. When he returned home, Ellison was still at the table, but something had changed. The front door had been left slightly ajar, something she would never do, and she was sitting too still, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped. When he entered, she looked up and motioned toward the floor beside her. There was a small white envelope, unmarked, sealed with a plastic clasp. Inside, two things: a printed list of usernames, names she recognized including her own, and beside each a series of access codes and terminal logs. It was a leak, a detailed map of who had access to the policy servers in the weeks leading up to the protocol changes. "I didn't request this," she said flatly, "but whoever left it wanted me to see something." Daniel scanned the list. Near the bottom, in faint gray font, was the alias she used on backup drives. Not one she had ever connected to the board's internal network. Next to it, 2 login attempts, one successful, routed through a proxy linked to an address in Arlington, Virginia. "This isn't just about a rogue contractor," she said. "This is systemic. Someone gave remote access to my off-network ID. That's why they scrubbed the logs. They didn't want anyone seeing how deeply they'd tunneled." Daniel didn't ask who "they" was. The shape of the enemy had changed. It wasn't one person. It was a structure. Layered, opaque, sanitized through official channels. Within hours, Ellison received a new notice, this time through her professional email, which had until now been untouched. It was a termination of consultancy. An automatic severance notice from a company she hadn't officially worked with in years, one of the umbrella contractors for the security services she'd helped design. The language was vague, but the implication was clear. Her professional record was being retroactively adjusted. Someone was rewriting her career footprint. That evening, Daniel installed new firmware into their home's internal network. His own design, developed years ago for environmental monitoring, but easily repurposed. It wasn't a defense system in the traditional sense. It logged data packets, monitored wireless signal shifts, tracked devices by MAC address. Within minutes, it flagged 3 new identifiers in their vicinity: 2 mobile, 1 static. The static signal was lodged near the utility easement 20 yards from their backyard fence. "We're being actively surveilled," Daniel said, his voice colder than usual. "And not by security guards on patrol. This is targeted." Ellison nodded once. She had already come to the same conclusion. But it wasn't the surveillance that rattled her. It was what followed. At precisely 2:03 a.m. that night, their front floodlights activated. Motion sensor. Ellison woke first, and within seconds Daniel was up, checking the monitor. The camera feed showed nothing unusual, just the slow sway of trees in the breeze, and then, near the edge of the frame, a small reflective object placed on the welcome mat. He didn't go out immediately. He waited, watching for several minutes, eyes flicking between feeds. No one moved. When he finally opened the door, the object was still there, a flattened badge case. Inside, a laminated card with no name, no title, just a photograph. The face was familiar. It was the man who had aimed the weapon at Ellison. The reverse side of the card was blank, except for a handwritten line: "I followed your rules. You taught us how." They didn't sleep after that. The next morning, they delivered the badge to Levin's office in a sealed evidence envelope. She took one look and said, "This is deeper than internal manipulation. If this man was deployed under revised rules written to appear as your work, and he's using that to justify action, even psychological intimidation, then we're looking at a liability firewall. They've designed a chain of deniability that loops through your name." She filed a formal injunction request that afternoon, demanding a hold on all protocols tied to Ellison's credentials pending forensic verification. That was when the retaliation escalated. The following evening, while Daniel was calibrating the new network sensors, the power flickered twice. then shut down entirely. Not just their house, the entire row of homes down their street. When he checked the circuit panel, it was intact. Not tripped, no overload. He walked the length of the block and found 3 other residents standing outside, confused, waiting for response from the maintenance office. But Daniel noticed something they hadn't. Each affected home belonged to someone who had served on a past resident oversight committee, most of whom had worked with Ellison during her initial advisory period. And then the messages started. Not official ones. Anonymous, untraceable emails routed through foreign servers, encrypted subject lines, some blank, others with cryptic attachments. One image showed Ellison entering a building from 3 months prior, annotated with false timestamps. Another was a screenshot of an internal forum discussion she'd once moderated, altered to make it appear as if she'd approved controversial measures she had never supported. They weren't just trying to isolate her, they were rewriting her. And it was working. One of her colleagues from another contract emailed a formal inquiry asking if she was under investigation, citing concerning information circulating through industry groups. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for 10 minutes. Daniel didn't try to pull her back. He knew better. This wasn't the moment to talk. It was the moment to decide. And when she stood, her face was different. Not broken, not angry, but something else. Calibrated. She looked at him and said, "We need to move fast, not to escape, to document, preserve, because what they're doing, it's a dry run. If they get away with it here, they'll scale it." Daniel nodded once. "Then let's build the counter map." And so they began. Not a rescue, not a revenge plan, but a data trail. Layered, encrypted, stored in locations even they didn't have full access to. A mechanism of truth. Because what they were up against wasn't just a bad policy or a rogue actor, it was a system with no face. A mask made from Ellison's work, weaponized in her name, wearing her authority like armor. The only way to fight it was not to expose it. It was to make it undeniable. The moment of fracture did not come from confrontation, nor from any grand reveal, but from a single overlooked server, one that Ellison had not interacted with in over a year, and whose contents she had assumed were no longer accessible after her. Consultancy had officially ended. It was, technically, a sandbox server, a temporary environment used for simulations and testing procedural updates before formal implementation. She had used it once to model a de-escalation framework during a high-profile project in Denver, and afterward left it untouched, like a forgotten room behind a locked door. But when Daniel was consolidating backup credentials, he noticed that her access token still pinged as active in that environment. Curious and increasingly methodical in his approach, he set up a direct query from their home system. What returned was more than a surprise. It was a real-time build log, dated just 3 weeks prior, running under her name, simulating a protocol she had never written. And the protocol was violent. It included breach procedures involving armed suppression, terms like threat containment in compliance-negative zones, and language that read like something from a counterinsurgency playbook. It was not just unethical. It was dangerous, and it bore her name in every header, every edit. She stared at the file for a long time, her face completely still, the cursor blinking in the corner of the screen like a taunt. Daniel said nothing. He knew the gravity of what they had found. This was no longer about a single manipulated policy or localized intimidation. It was systemic mimicry. Someone was using her expertise, her tone, her authority, and building new, darker doctrines atop it. Worse still, the protocols were tagged with deployment markers, active testing in classified beta environments, one of which was geolocated less than 40 miles from their home. "This is proof," Daniel said finally. "Actionable proof. They're using your identity to develop unauthorized systems. We take this to Levin, and she builds a federal case." But Ellison didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on a line in the metadata. "Look at this routing path," she said. "This isn't just local testing. They're exporting the framework to external review teams. Look at the IP. It's routed through defense contractor domains. That's military subcontracting infrastructure." Daniel's mouth tightened. "You think this is a federal contract?" "I think it's a shadow version of what I wrote, repackaged and sold without oversight. And if they're getting away with it here, under my name, that means it's already gone farther than we can trace." The weight of that realization flattened the room. They weren't simply victims of a smear campaign or digital theft. They were, in effect, unknowing ghostwriters for a security doctrine being built for applications far beyond residential control. Ellison backed up the files, encrypted them, and sent the package to Levin within the hour. But she didn't stop there. She also sent it to 3 other recipients. Contacts from her academic days, people she hadn't spoken to in years but trusted with one thing: pattern recognition. She didn't ask for intervention. She asked them to tell her if they'd seen anything similar. She included the server log, the modification trail, the export paths. Then she shut off her computer, took a breath, and said to Daniel, "We may have just crossed a line we can't walk back from." The consequences arrived with surgical timing. 2 nights later, their house lost internet access entirely. Not a network error, but a total service kill, something that required physical interference. When Daniel checked the service box near the curb, the fiber line had been severed with a precision blade. Not chewed by rodents, not struck by accident. Cut, stripped, and resealed with insulating tape so it wouldn't be noticed on a glance. The next morning, a maintenance van parked across from their house and didn't move for 6 hours. No one got in or out. No markings. Daniel photographed the plates, sent them to a registry query service. The plate came back listed to a different vehicle model in another state. When Levin reviewed the documentation Ellison had sent, her tone shifted. "This is bigger than misuse. This is identity cloning at an institutional level. You're being shadowed by a parallel system, one that treats your authorship as a toolkit, not a liability." She contacted an external forensic firm to validate the file trail and determine where the exports had been routed. Within 2 days, they confirmed her fear. The protocols had been reviewed by a joint venture entity operating under dual classification, a private military partnership with overseas field testing. They were building live operational doctrine using Ellison's framework, with no attribution and no chain of custody. That was the moment the story stopped being personal. "I thought they wanted to ruin my name," Ellison said. "But they don't care about the name. They want the credibility attached to it. They want the form, not the origin." She was silent for a long time after that. Then she walked to the bookshelf, pulled down an old notebook she hadn't opened in years, and began to write. Long form, pen to paper, with no keyboard, no device. Daniel didn't interrupt. When she finished an hour later, she tore out the page and sealed it in an envelope, unmarked. "If anything happens to me," she said quietly, "send this to my old program director. He'll know where it needs to go." Daniel nodded. He didn't ask what was in the letter. They had crossed from retaliation to erasure, and the only way forward now was to make their presence undeniable. Not loud, not public, but unerasable. Because the war being fought wasn't one of violence. It was one of authorship, and someone had already written the ending. News of the inspection spread faster than she expected. 2 days after the federal team departed, Layla received a visit from a man she'd never met, dressed in casual denim, driving a county vehicle with faded stripes. Needed. But now, after weeks of digital manipulation, intercepted communication, and data wipes that made their own identities feel unstable, she decided to return to paper. Not just as a method of control, but as insurance. In that file, she found the original handwritten versions of her earliest procedural frameworks. Doctrines she had written by hand, edited by colleagues, stamped with review signatures before they were ever uploaded to servers. It was a version of history that couldn't be rewritten without ink and fingerprints. She laid out each document on the living room floor and started matching them to what was being distributed in her name across shadowed networks. Daniel watched from the doorway, trying not to interrupt but unable to ignore the change in her posture. She wasn't just reviewing anymore. She was rebuilding a legal map, restoring authorship in analog form, in case every server they relied on went dark. That precaution proved prescient. The next day, Daniel discovered that their encrypted cloud storage, hosted through a third-party cryptographic firm in Montreal, had been suspended. No warning, no explanation, just a generic message about compliance review. When he attempted to initiate recovery protocols through a secondary gateway, his IP address was flagged, and the terminal was locked for 72 hours. He immediately called Levin, who was already ahead of him. Her own secure storage had been hit the same way. "This is coordinated," she said. "They're not just closing access. They're severing continuity, cutting you off from everything that proves what you are." Daniel didn't ask how they had gotten to a firm in Montreal. He knew. The reach of this operation went beyond legal jurisdiction. It was transnational, layered, and funded. Whoever was behind it wasn't protecting their actions. They were preparing for scrutiny, pre-clearing their own tracks in case the exposure spread. That night, a black SUV parked down the block and didn't move. No lights, no motion, no plates. It was the third night in a row they'd seen the same vehicle, always at different angles, always just far enough away to deny its presence if questioned. When Daniel approached it at dawn the next day, it was gone. No tire tracks, no debris. Ellison didn't comment. She simply rolled out a large paper grid on the kitchen table and began mapping interaction nodes, contacts, known systems, confirmed interference points, with timestamps and relational notes. She used red for confirmed breaches, blue for suspected interference, black for shadow pathways. Within an hour, the grid looked like a siege map. Not just a list of threats, but a logic tree of how their identities were being consumed. Then the real message arrived. Not by email, not by courier, by radio. Their emergency ham receiver, something Daniel had installed years ago as a hobby, buzzed to life at a frequency that had been silent for weeks. A male voice, calm, unaccented, read a string of numbers, then paused. Ellison Lowell. Protocol integrity no longer required. Final confirmation received. All routing paths have been adjusted. Please acknowledge. Then, silence. Daniel looked at her, and she returned the stare without blinking. "That wasn't a threat," she said. "That was a release. They think they've completed the transition. I'm no longer necessary." She stood up, walked to the hallway cabinet, and removed an old emergency binder, one they hadn't touched since moving. Inside were their evacuation plans, identity backups, off-grid access points. They didn't speak for several minutes, just began moving. By midday, they had packed essential files, hardware drives, encrypted duplicates of all relevant data, and physical documents. They didn't run. They repositioned, temporarily relocating to a secure apartment Daniel had acquired years earlier through a development contract in a nearby city, under a separate name, never associated with Ellison's credentials. From there, they initiated the next step. Not exposure, not confrontation, but seeding. They began uploading fragments of the falsified protocols to private professional forums, metadata intact without attribution. Levin, operating from a parallel channel, sent flagged versions to ethics review boards, citing potential AI-authored security policies attributed to real professionals without consent. The language was deliberate. The implication that someone was testing the waters of plausible deniability, blaming automated drafting for policy atrocities and using real names as fig leaves. The reaction was cautious but immediate. One private security review group issued an internal advisory to its members. Verify authorship of any protocols referencing Level 3 tactical engagement outside federal oversight. Consult original contributors. Watch for name duplication. The message had landed, but the retaliation changed form again. 3 days after the leaks began, Daniel received a call from the credit bureau. Anomalies had appeared in their profiles. Loans initiated. Transfers attempted. His identity had been flagged in a financial crime database in Singapore. It wasn't theft. It was overlay. Someone was constructing shadow identities using fragments of his real profile, tied to accounts with real money, not to spend, to dirty the chain. Ellison's passport was also flagged. International travel hold imposed due to pending procedural review from a contract she had never signed. They're flooding the records, she said, making it impossible to separate truth from manipulation, and when you can't tell the difference, you stop trusting the source. That's the end game. Meanwhile, Levin's own firm was targeted by an anonymous complaint claiming she had coordinated a false cyber intrusion report to manipulate legal outcomes. She responded immediately, issuing a counterbrief backed by 4 cybersecurity experts who confirmed the authenticity of the breach logs. But the damage was done. The firm advised her to minimize involvement. "We're at the cliff," she told them. "One step further, and they'll push us into irrelevance. You'll become a digital mirage, visible but inaccessible, traceable but unverifiable." Ellison understood. She responded not with panic, but with architecture. That evening, she and Daniel began constructing what she called the mirror, a cleanroom archive of her real work, her real voice, her real design logic. It was stored offline across redundant drives with voice logs, physical copies, and analog verification trails. Not for the courts, not for the media, for history. Because when systems collapse, truth doesn't survive by winning arguments. It survives by outlasting the fire. Then came the final knock. Not from law enforcement, not from a courier, from a man in plain clothes who introduced himself only as Mr. Gray. He arrived mid-morning, alone, no ID, but with a perfectly rehearsed tone of bureaucratic authority. He didn't threaten. He advised. He told them calmly that further resistance would result in reputational reassignment, a term so sterile it took Ellison a full second to register its meaning. When she asked what his affiliation was, he smiled faintly and said, "That's not the point. The system has moved on. You're interfering with policy evolution. That's a liability." Daniel stood beside her. "You pointed a weapon at my wife and rewrote her life," he said, "and now you're here to ask politely that we disappear." Mr. Gray didn't blink. "We're asking that you let the system optimize. You were valuable, but now you're noise." Then he walked away. Ellison closed the door. She turned to Daniel. "Then let's be noise they can't erase." The day of the hearing arrived without ceremony. No subpoenas, no public announcements, just a scheduled administrative review before the Internal Oversight Council, an entity not judicial in function but regulatory, the kind of body designed to settle procedural disputes without drawing media attention. Ellison had demanded the right to appear through her attorney under Procedural Challenge Clause 12b, and after weeks of delay, the request had been quietly approved. The hearing was to be held at the community's Central Operations Annex, in a secured wing typically reserved for internal disciplinary sessions and contractor evaluations. It was, in effect, a stage, but Ellison knew better than to treat it like theater. She was not there to perform. She was there to insert truth into a machine designed to overwrite it. The building's interior was antiseptic, windowless, with soft LED lights that muted the shape of shadows. The panel seated at the long conference table was composed of 7 individuals, 5 of whom Ellison recognized from past engagements, names she had once listed as references, people who had praised her procedural clarity, her ability to translate, tactical necessity into civil restraint. They did not look at her now. Their eyes remained on the table or the data tablets in front of them. Only one, a man she didn't recognize, made eye contact as she sat down beside Levin. The opening statements were short. The board declared that the matter under review concerned potential procedural conflicts arising from overlapping authorship claims. The phrasing was clinical, bloodless. Levin countered immediately, submitting the original documentation, hard copies and verified metadata logs showing the original protocols as written, signed, and archived by Ellison, with comparative versions showing unauthorized modifications traced to external servers. She also presented the server trail leading to the sandbox testing environment, the export logs to classified subcontractor IPs, and a time-stamped map of access breaches. No one interrupted. No one challenged the chain of custody. The board simply noted the documentation and asked Ellison whether she wished to provide a personal statement. She stood without theatrics, holding nothing in her hands. Her voice was calm, but it didn't lack weight. "You know who I am," she said. "You know what I wrote. You know the purpose of my work. Every clause, every condition, every limitation was designed to prevent misuse, not to make enforcement easier, to make it safer, for everyone. I didn't just write protocols. I wrote boundaries, and now you've removed them. Quietly, without attribution, using my voice, my structure, to build something I never approved." She paused, looking directly at the one unfamiliar man on the panel. "You replaced restraint with dominance. You replaced clarity with vagueness. You replaced accountability with automation. And you did it in my name." There was a moment of absolute stillness in the room, not a single breath out of place. Then the panel chair asked her to sit. Levin continued the case, citing precedent under the Digital Identity Safeguard Act, introducing expert testimony through a secure line, one of the data architects who had helped Ellison construct her original version control system. He testified that the recent revisions exhibited clear signs of forged authentication routing and that the presence of Ellison's identifiers across unauthorized implementations could only be achieved through deliberate credential hijack at the administrative level. The panel asked no follow-up questions. Instead, they recessed for deliberation. Ellison and Levin waited outside in a low-ceilinged lobby with gray walls and no windows. Daniel joined them 10 minutes later, having arrived through a separate entrance to avoid being flagged by building surveillance. He didn't speak at first, just nodded to Ellison, offering silent solidarity. After 47 minutes, the panel returned. The chair stood, adjusted his blazer, and delivered the decision in a tone so measured it felt rehearsed. The board acknowledges procedural inconsistencies in the authorship trail presented by Ms. Lowell and accepts that the current operating protocol does not reflect the originally approved doctrine. As such, effective immediately, the existing enforcement framework is suspended pending external review. The board also issues a formal retraction of all procedural attributions to Ms. Lowell until such time that authorship can be conclusively audited. Furthermore, we will notify all contractors and affiliates of this procedural freeze. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a reset. A silent admission that they had gone too far and now sought to walk it back quietly. Ellison didn't smile, didn't exhale. She simply nodded once, stood, and walked out of the room. The hearing was over, but the battle wasn't, because as they left the building, Daniel noticed the SUV again, parked across the street, half concealed behind a maintenance trailer. Same angle, same black windows. But this time, someone was inside, watching. When they returned to the apartment, the message was waiting for them. Slipped under the door, no envelope, just a single sheet of paper with a line typed in the center. Process rollback acknowledged. Oversight restored. Presence no longer required. No signature. No threats. Just a suggestion that they stop now. That the system had been corrected and their role was over. Ellison stared at the paper for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "They think we wanted to win." Daniel looked at her. "Didn't we?" "No," she said. "We wanted the truth restored, but they're treating it like a win-loss scenario. They think we played a hand and now we fold." He waited. And they're wrong. That night, she uploaded the full record of the modified doctrines to a secure academic review archive, attached to a white paper authored anonymously but with encrypted references traceable only through internal credential pathways. She sent the packet to 3 international watchdog agencies, marked as unverified doctrine propagation under civilian facade. Then she destroyed the drives. The story wasn't about attribution anymore. It was about permanence. And no amount of rollback could erase what had already been tested, deployed, or archived in places beyond their reach. Ellison knew they hadn't saved the system, but they had revealed it, and now it would have to hide differently. That was enough. For now. The rain started just after dawn, a slow, steady pattern against the apartment's tall windows. Daniel stood by the kitchen sink, watching it coat the balcony, his hand wrapped around a mug gone lukewarm. Behind him, Ellison sat on the couch, a legal pad balanced on her knee, scribbling a new framework by hand. Not for a client, not for publication, but for herself. A rearticulation of what authority should look like. Not just what she'd lost, but what she had learned about control, transparency, and the speed at which systems mutate when no one is watching. Outside, the street was quiet. The SUV had not returned in 4 days. Their phones had stopped buzzing with false alerts. No more routine verifications, no more courier slips with blank return addresses. Silence had returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was a stillness shaped by aftermath, not safety. A week had passed since the hearing, and while the formal suspension of the falsified protocols remained in place, no public statement had followed. The board had made their internal corrections, scrubbed Ellison's name from documents, restored her original work to archived status, and locked the system from further unsanctioned edits. But there had been no apology, no reinstatement of her role, no recognition that her career had been used as a scaffolding for weaponized doctrine. They did not refute what she'd exposed. They simply erased her and moved on, adjusting their trajectory by a few degrees, enough to avoid collision, but not enough to change the destination. Levin had urged caution in the following days, advising them to maintain legal distance while third-party reviews unfolded. She was working quietly with international compliance auditors now, trying to track how far the exported frameworks had traveled, which subcontractors had implemented them, and what might still be in circulation under derivative names. But progress was slow. The farther doctrine traveled, the more it became buried under legal obfuscation and non-disclosure wrappers. "You did what you could," she had told Ellison on their last call. "You froze the infection at the source. That alone is rare." Ellison had thanked her, but the words rang hollow. Because freezing wasn't dismantling, and she knew what remained beneath the surface. Daniel, sensing her tension, began rebuilding their home infrastructure, not with the urgency of defense, but with the care of re-establishing autonomy. He reprogrammed the mesh network to operate without external dependencies, installed new surveillance redundancies on closed-loop power. Every camera, every storage unit, every alert system now ran independent of cloud routing or administrative escalation. Not in fear, in acknowledgement, because trust, once compromised, is rarely repaired. It must be replaced. Ellison, in turn, returned to something she had avoided for years: instruction. She began drafting materials designed not for corporations or agencies, but for individuals, civilians, small business owners, independent advisors. A course not in tactical procedure, but in system awareness. How to detect early manipulation. How to recognize when policies are evolving without oversight. How to understand the difference between enforced order and assumed consent. She didn't advertise it. She simply uploaded it, piece by piece, to decentralized archives and encrypted libraries that indexed by protocol logic, not author tag. Some would find it, most wouldn't. That was fine. It was there, because this story was never meant to end with a clean victory. There were no arrests, no confessions, no headlines. The systems she had once built would continue to evolve, now carrying shadows of her voice twisted by those who had needed her expertise, but not her ethics. That couldn't be undone, but it could be remembered. A month later, they moved again, not far, just enough to regain control over environment and infrastructure. A single-story property surrounded by overgrown hedges and natural stone, far from any central management. Daniel spent his mornings restoring the irrigation lines. Ellison wrote in the afternoons, windows open, breeze carrying in the smell of earth and cedar. Juno had a yard to patrol, and for the first time in weeks she no longer barked at shadows. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last of the sunset fade through the trees, Ellison turned to Daniel and said, "They're going to try again." He nodded once. "Maybe not here." "No," she said, "but somewhere." They sat in silence for a while, then she said, "Next time, I won't just be ready, I'll be waiting.